सक्तुमिवतित उना पुनन्तो यत्र धीरा मनसा वाचमक्रता अत्रा सखा यः सख्यानि जानते भद्रेषां लक्ष्मीः निहिताधिवाची सहना भवतु सहनौ भुनक्तु सह वीर्यङ्करवावहै तेजस्विनावधीतमस्तु मा विद्विषावहै। ॐ शान्तिः शान्तिः शान्तिः। सर्वेभ्यो नमः। At the outset, I offer my respectful pranams to the sacred and reverential memory of Pujya Swamiji Dayananda Saraswati Ji, in whose remembrance this series of conferences has been organized. I also offer my pranams to Pujya Swamini Atma Prajnananda Saraswati Ji, who has been tirelessly organizing these conferences year and year all over again. Without wasting much time, I shall come to the topic of my talk, and I am very happy to be addressing you all in this virtual platform. At least I did not have the pleasure to be there physically at the venue, but nonetheless, this is a great honor, and I once again offer my thanks to Pujya Swamini Ji. I have chosen to talk to you all about a story, and it is not often that in conferences such as these that the topic would be a story. So why have I chosen a story? It is because of two main reasons. One, we Indians have always loved stories. The Vedas are full of stories themselves. There are the various devas and devatas, their moods and various aspirations of the people who sang in praises of those deities, their deeds, their misgivings, their hopes, their aspirations, and so on, have been captured in various remarkable, wonderful stories. And it is not just the Veda Samhitas, the Brahmanas, which form a part of the Vedas, a significant portion of the Vedas. They contain numerous stories as well. And if we go on to the Puranas, Puranas, as we all know, are veritable repositories of stories. We have not just the Devas, the Devatas, but also kings who ruled the earth and their lineages, people who led all kinds of lives. We have fascinating stories with respect to all these individuals. And the greatest stories, perhaps, to emerge from our land are the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. So it is abundantly clear that we have always loved our stories, not just to create stories, to narrate them, even to listen to stories, has been very dear to us. So why not a story as a topic to present before an august audience? And the second reason, and this reason is also very important, is that stories come with multiple suggestions. The story can be compared to a seed which holds within itself a whole tree. A seed is waiting to grow into an entire tree. It is waiting for the right kind of atmosphere, the right kind of nourishment, and then it is only a matter of time that it will evolve into a tree. So the tradition of Sanskrit poetics or aesthetics, that is the Alankara Shastra, gives or has given the kind of nourishment that the seed or the story has to receive for it to evolve into an entire tree. So we have the tools in order to analyze a story and appreciate its various nuances, unearth its various suggestions. Like we all know, stories, most of the times, at least good stories, the better among the stories, are full of suggestions. And the story that we are going to discuss is one such. So which is this story? The story is about poetry, poetry itself, and it is called as the Kavya Purushotpatti, or the emergence of the Kavya Purusha. Kavya Purusha is the embodiment of poetry, and we will get to know in a short while how all this happened. And who has told us this story? Where do we find this story first? The scholar who has narrated this story, or even a poet, he was both a good one, a good scholar and a poet. He was Rajashekhara. Rajashekhara lived in central India many thousand years ago, the 9th century or 10th century. He lived in Kanyakubja. He was a great polymath. He was even a polyglot. He was conversant with and familiar and proficient in many languages: Sanskrit, the various Prakritas, the Indian languages prevalent in his time, and so on. And he had the title of Kaviraja, and in his own work, he has defined very clearly what it takes to be called a Kaviraja. The poet or scholar had to be conversant with all the kinds of languages prevalent in his time, all the dialects, all the varieties of Prakrit, and so on. And since we know that Rajasekhara was a Kaviraja himself, we can comfortably surmise that he knew all kinds of Prakrit. He has also written various plays in the various Prakrita, so it is not even a guess, it is a matter of fact. So we got to know that Rajasekhara was born in Kanyakubja and he lived in the 10th century, to put it roughly. He is the author of many Rupakas or plays, and one very popular among his Rupakas is the Bala Ramayana. He has written other works as well, the Viddhashala Vanjika, the Karpura Manjari, and so on, and these works have enriched both Sanskrit literature and Prakrit literature. He is supposed to have composed an epic poem as well, titled the Haravilasa, but unfortunately the work is no longer available. We only find references to it in the works of Rajasekhara himself. And because Rajasekhara was a poet and scholar of this high order, he was also very proud of his accomplishments. He thought of himself as the person who continued the legacy or the embodiment himself of Valmiki, of Bhartramenta and Bhavabhuti. He says in a very popular verse in the work Balaramayana, Babhuva Valmika Bhavah Kavih Pura Tatah Prapede Bhuvi Bhartramenthataam स्थितः पुनर्यो भवभूतिरेखया savartate samprati Rajasekharaha. So he says, the person you see before you, Rajasekhara, that is I myself, I am Valmiki, I am Bhartramenta, I am also Bhavabhuti. So the person who was born as Valmiki previously took on the form of Bhartramenta and Bhavabhuti and now stands as Rajasekhara in this form before you. That is how Rajasekhara associates the greatness that comes with all these poets with himself. So naturally he was proud of all his accomplishments. He was not just proud of himself, but he also had great pride for his wife, Avanti Sundari, and this is something very fascinating. In the whole range of Sanskrit literature, we find only a handful of couples, of husbands and wives, who are both proficient in the languages of their choice, who are both literateurs, who are both scholars, and who are both poets. And what is more fascinating is Rajasekhara, whenever he discusses a poetic concept in his various works, for instance, here in this work, which is the Kavya Mimamsa, a work on poetics or Alankara Shastra, he quotes the views of his own wife, Avanti Sundari, and then goes on to say whether he agrees with her, whether he disagrees with her, and so on. But he considers her views as worthy of notice, and Rajasekhara was of the considered opinion that women can be great scholars and poets too. He says, Yoshitopi Kavi Bhaveyuhu, in a remarkable line in his work. So that was about Rajasekhara and his wife Avanti Sundari. And the story that we are going to discuss today, like I said, is a part of the treatise on poetics called as Kavya Mimamsa. The story itself is in the 3rd chapter of Kavya Mimamsa. This work is a manual for poets. That is, it belongs to the category of works on Alankara Shastra called as Kavishiksha. Kavishiksha is the kind of works which are thought of as aids for budding poets. If a poet wants to know what are the rules to be followed when he wants to write a piece of poetry, then these works come to his aid. What are the meters to be followed? What are the poetic conventions? What are the figures of speech? And so on and so forth. There are many works of this genre, and Kavya Mimamsa is arguably the first work of this sort, and it is also a very good work of this sort. And Kavya Mimamsa was initially conceived as an encyclopedic work, in that Rajashekhara wanted to discuss perhaps all the adhikaranas, all the concepts of Alankara Shastra, Riti, Guna, Paka, Shayya, Vakrata, Shabdartha Alankaras, and Rasa, and Vakrokti, Auchitya, and so on. Dhwani is a different issue. There are arguments about whether or not Rajashekhara described or subscribed to the Dhwani theory presented by Anandavardhana. But that is an entirely different discussion. Let us not get there. But Kavya Mimamsa was originally thought of as an encyclopedic treatise. But as we have the work now, the available form, in the available form, it only has the first chapter of the work that was originally conceived. So it is said that Rajashekhara set out to write 18 adhikaranas, of which only the first adhikarana, which is titled the Kavi Rahasya, is available to us now. And in this small slice alone, Rajashekhara has discussed several novel topics, or several novel tattvas of Alankara Shastra, which are not to be found elsewhere. For instance, he discusses the two kinds of pratibha. Pratibha, as we all know, is integral to poetry, lies at the heart of all poetic expression, and Rajashekhara speaks of pratibha in two ways. One is the Karayitri pratibha, or creative imagination, that a poet should be endowed with if he has to compose poetry. The other is Bhavayitri pratibha, or appreciative imagination, that is required in all rasikas or sahridayas if they want to savor a piece of poetry. So Bhavayitri pratibha, Karayitri pratibha. Rajashekhara was the first person to classify pratibha in this very understandable manner. Rajashekhara also discusses the various kinds of poets. Is poetry something that is poetry something that comes from birth, or can poetry be acquired? What are the factors that are conducive to poetry? Vyutpatti, Abhyasa, and so on. And he also talks about something called as the Kavicharya. How does what does a typical day in the life of a poet look like? When does he get up? What is his daily routine? When does he go about composing his poetry? Who are his audience? And how does he spend time with various sahridayas? And he discusses all those factors. And this is modeled after the Rutucharya in Ayurvedic treatises, the Rajacharya, which is presented in the various Arthashastric treatises, and the Nagarika Vrittanta that we see in Kama Shastra, and so on. So Rajashekhara has derived inspiration from all these various Shastras and has gone on to delineate the various aspects of Kavicharya in this work. He has also discussed the various ways in which people of his day used to pronounce various languages. For instance, if this is limited to Sanskrit alone, how people in the north pronounce Sanskrit, how in the south, and what are the ways employed in the east, in the west, and so on. So we get this fascinating discussion, or this enumeration at least, of how Sanskrit was spoken back in the 10th century, and these details are not at all available in any other works. Rajashekhara also describes the harana, a concept called harana, how poetry, or how poets borrow or even brazenly steal the ideas or phrases from other works or from other poets. He discusses Shabda Harana, Artha Harana, Shabdartha Harana, and so on. And he also discusses poetic conventions, or Kavi Samaya. the sun makes the lotus bloom, and the moon causes the um, lilies to bloom, and the sun causes the lilies to wither, and so on and so forth. Fame is white in color, and so on. There are various Kavi Samayas in Sanskrit. So Kavya Mimamsa is a repository of such varied topics, and not just the content that we discussed, which is embedded in this work, the form in which the content is expressed is also very arresting. Rajashekhara was a master of the Sanskrit language, of especially the Sanskrit prose. The language of the Kavya Mimamsa is stirs and maintains the rigor and vigor that is expected of a work on Shastra, and at the same time it is very crisp, succinct, and yet poetic, and yet fragrant with the idioms of the language that come naturally. So this is one other reason to study this work, Kavya Mimamsa of Rajashekhara. Now, be that as it may, we shall come to the main story. The story, like I said, relates to the birth of Kavya or Kavya Purusha, and this is the story behind poetry. The third chapter of Rajashekhara's Kavya Mimamsa presents to us this fascinating story. Now, the story of Kavya Purusha has been presented in various other works as well, in various Puranas and other Kavyas also, not necessarily Shastra Granthas. For instance, the Saraswatyupakhyana in the Vayu Purana relates the same story, and Banabhatta's Harsha Charita also narrates the same story. But Rajashekhara has utilized um, the the seeds of the story, so to say, and has presented to us in a very beautiful manner, in a very suggestive manner. That is very important. So, what is the story? When the story begins, Saraswati, or the deity of learning of all the Vidyas in the Indian tradition, she desired to have a child. She had this Santana Kaman, and in order to beget a child, she performed tapas on the slopes of the mountain Himalaya here on earth, and pleased with her tapas, which was spread over many years, Brahma was pleased with her, and he blessed her to have a child. And so Saraswati got her child, and he was the Kavya Purusha. So as soon as Kavya Purusha was born, he addressed his mother in metrically perfect verses, verses which were composed then and there by Kavya Purusha, which were metrically flawless, and he spoke in the form of verses. What usually happens when a baby is born is that it gives out a cry, it begins crying, and it is wailing, and it has just come out from the womb of the mother and taking in the uh, environment of the world for the first time, and no wonder that it begins to cry. But here is Kavya Purusha, who does not cry, who begins to speak, and begins to speak not just in prose but in perfectly structured verses. That was how Kavya Purusha was born. And Saraswati was obviously wonderstruck to see this child so, and she began to praise her own child. She says, You aho shlaghaniyo, see Rajashekhara says, you are fascinating, and your body is made up of Shabda and Artha, which is the seat of poetry, and your mouth or your entire face is made of Sanskrit, or it represents the divine language Sanskrit. The various Prakritas, or the one kind of Prakrit language, is your shoulders. The Apabhramsha language is your back. The Paishacha Prakrita is your feet. The Mishra Bhasha, or the Mishra Prakrita, is your chest, and all kinds of gunas, or the excellences or the qualities of poetry. You have all those gunas, Ojas, Prasada, Madhurya, and so on. And Chamatkara resides in your speech. If Chamatkara has to find a home, it is only in your speech. And your Atma is Rasa itself, and the body, and or at least the hair on your body, are the various meters, the Varnavrittas, Matra Jatis, and so on. Prahelika and the other forms of Chitra Kavya, the Gati Chitras, Bandha Chitras, etc., are the ways and means by which you entertain yourself, and the various figures of speech, the Shabdalankaras, the Arthalankaras, etc., are the ornaments that bedeck you. And Shruti herself, the Veda itself, has sung in praise of you. The Veda mantra goes, चत्वारि शृङ्गास्त्रयोऽस्य पादाद्वेषीर्षे सप्तहस्ता आसो अस्या त्रिधा बुद्धो वृषभोरोरवीति महो देवो मर्त्यान् आविवेश. This is a verse which is present in the Rig Veda, also in the Yajur Veda, interpreted in several ways by various scholars belonging to various darshanas in our tradition. And here we have Rajashekara referring to this verse in relation to the Kavya Purusha. So Saraswati sang in praise of her own child and requests him, although you are great in this manner, you possess all these qualities, try to behave like a child. You please conceal all these great qualities of yours and try to behave like a baby, like my own child. And having requested her child in this manner, Saraswati left the child there and went to take a bath in the divine river Ganga. So by that time, apparently the sun was up in the sky and it was very hot everywhere, and the baby was perhaps lying on a piece of rock that was all heated up because of the sun's increasing temperature, which was increasing every minute. And the baby began to cry. Saraswati had asked her child to behave as a baby, and it did, and it began to cry now. And Shukracharya happened to come there in that direction. He was coming there in order to collect samit and kusha grass that is required for his austerities, for his yaga and daily sandhya and so on. And he saw this child, and he was immediately moved that this baby was left here all alone and he could see nobody around. So he took the child with him to his own ashrama. And as soon as the baby was comfortably settled in the ashrama of Shukracharya, it caused in Shukracharya the desire to come up with poetry. And Shukracharya immediately composed this verse of its own accord. This verse rolled off Shukracharya's tongue. Ya dugdha pina dugdheva kavidogdhrubhiranvaham rudinas sannidhattam sa suktidhenus saraswati. And beginning at that moment, Shukracharya came to be known as Kavi in this world. So the synonym for Shukracharya, like we know in Sanskrit, is Kavi. And why is Shukracharya addressed as a Kavi? It is because of this. It is because he composed this verse, at least Rajashekara says so, drawing the inspiration from Kavya Purusha. And by that time Saraswati finished bathing and came there, and she was distraught because she could not see the child. And Rajashekara comes up with this brilliant twist in the tale. He says that Valmiki was seeing all this happen, and he had seen Shukracharya take the baby with him to his ashrama, and Valmiki came there before Saraswati and told her what everything that had happened, and directed her to the ashrama of Shukracharya. So Saraswati was immensely pleased with Valmiki for helping her out so wonderfully. She had one look at her baby and was relieved of all her mental tensions and all her agony, and she blessed Valmiki. She caused in him the desire to compose poetry, and she taught him the secret of metrical versification, of poetic verses. And Valmiki, who was thus blessed by Saraswati herself, went on to compose the Valmiki Ramayana. Before that, when he was in the moment of inspiration, in the immediate wake of receiving the blessings from Devi Saraswati, he saw this pair of birds which were sporting on the branch of a tree, and a hunter came there, shot an arrow, brought down one of the birds, and Valmiki was immediately moved, and he composed a verse without his knowing it himself. Ma nishada pratishtham tvam agama shashvati samaha yat kroncha mithunadekam avadhihi kama mohitam. and because he composed this verse and went on to write the entire Ramayana, he is known as the Adikavi. And Rajashekhara tells us that Vyasa, in a later time, studied very religiously the composition of Valmiki, the Ramayana, which is the Adikavya, and himself went on to compose the Mahabharata. Now, at this juncture in the story, the Devas and the Rishis or the Maharshis, they have this debate going on in the Brahmaloka or the Satyaloka, and they cannot figure out what is the correct meaning of a particular Veda mantra. So Brahma immediately wanted Saraswati to be there. So because Saraswati is the Adhidevata of all the Vidyas, she has to be there to adjudicate and immediately clarify the import of this particular mantra. So Saraswati had to leave her child and go. And Saraswati told her son that, look, I have to go there to settle this issue that has come up in Brahmaloka, and you cannot come there because nobody is supposed to enter the Brahmaloka without the Agnya or the Ahvana of Brahmadeva. So I have to go, I am leaving you here, and she immediately left. Now the Kavya Purusha was obviously very angry with his mother, and he began to roam in all the directions. He was overcome with Rosha and he began roaming in all the directions. Rajashekhara also has one another interesting detail to add, that this Kavya Purusha had a friend who was Subramhanya or Skanda, the son of Shiva and Parvati. Subramhanya was also distraught because his friend was now in such a pitiable state. He had been, he had been forsaken by his mother. His mother had herself forsook him. So Subramhanya went to his own mother Parvati and told her of the pitiable condition in which his friend was and asked her to help. So Parvati came up with this ingenious solution. The only way to stop a person from moving about in all the directions, apparently according to Parvati at least, is to get him married. And Parvati created this girl, this woman called the Sahitya Vidyavadhu or the Sahitya Vidya. So if Kavya Purusha is the embodiment of poetry, Sahitya Vidya is the science of poetry or poetics. She created this Sahitya Vidya and asked her to follow Kavya Purusha wherever he went, to follow him in all the directions, try to cajole him, coax him, get him back to his senses, and so on. And she also ordered the various sages, the rishis, the munis who were present there to sing in praises of this couple, of the couple that was Kavya Purusha and Sahitya Vidya Vadhu. And Sahitya Vidya followed Kavya Purusha as she was instructed by Saraswati, and Kavya Purusha went in various directions, and wherever they went, in the four directions of India, they were clothed in various manners, they spoke in various languages, and they also, the Sahitya Vidya, she sang, she performed dance recitals and so on in order to win over the attention of Kavya Purusha. So this couple, they gave rise to various pravrittis, vrittis and ritis, says Rajashekhara. So the various pravrittis are the Vesha Vinyasa, the kind of clothes that Kavya Purusha wore, the kind of clothes that Sahitya Vidya Vadhu wore. The people in those particular regions, be it in the north, be it in the south and so on, the people of those particular regions would imitate this couple, would imitate or wear the same kinds of clothes that this couple would wear. And the vrittis would be the Vilasa Vidhanas. If the Sahitya Vidya sang a song in order to please Kavya Purusha, the women folk in that particular region would immediately memorize that song and sing it themselves, give it even a poetic twist and so on. If she would dance, these people would pick it up and build on it, develop it and so on. So this is how pravrittis and vrittis were developed. Then there were the ritis, the form in which this couple spoke to each other, this couple interacted with the people in those various regions. The Vachana Vinyasa took the form of various ritis. So Rajashekhara enumerates in the eastern part of India the Audramagadhi Pravritti, Bharati Vritti, and Gaudiya Riti. These things emerged because of the presence of Kavya Purusha and Sahitya Vidyā Vadhu in that region. In the Panchala country, there came up the Panchala Madhyama Pravritti, Satvati and Arabhati Vrittis, and the Panchali Riti. In the countries of Avanti, etc., that is in central India, perhaps, we have the Avanti Pravritti, Satvati and Kaishiki Vrittis. In the southern part of India, there is the Dakshinatya Pravritti, the Kaishiki Vritti, and Vaidarbhi Riti. And perhaps when Rajashekhara tells us that when they came to the southern part of the country, Kavya Purusha began to show interest in Sahitya Vidyā Vadhu, and when they came to this place called Vatsagulma, Sahitya Vidyā Vadhu totally won over Kavya Purusha and they got married to each other. And this is the various vrittis, ritis and pravrittis that they gave birth to. So vrittis, ritis and pravrittis, I'll explain them later, are really poetic concepts, and Rajashekhara has wonderfully embedded them in the course of this story. So Sahitya Vidyā Vadhu and Kavya Purusha get married in the Gandharva fashion, and this is how a bond is forged, a relationship is forged between Saraswati and Parvati also. They became bandhus with each other because Kavya Purusha and Sahitya Vidyā Vadhu are now husband and wife, and they blessed them. Parvati and Saraswati blessed this couple and said, you can from now on, you may reside in the hearts of the poets and may you live happily forever. And they also apparently constructed a new Swarga or heaven for them called as the Kaviloka. This is the story. This is the basic outline of the story. Why is this story very interesting, and what has this to do in a serious Indological conference? Why have I chosen this as the topic? It is because from this story emerge great insights into poetry, into the science of poetry or poetics or Alankara Shastra. Let us try to follow the suggestions which probably Rajashekhara had in mind when he wrote this story in his work. Because Kavya Mimamsa is a very unique work, though it in the form of the Shastra it explains various concepts, comes up with definitions, gives examples and enumerates things in the typical Shastraic fashion. It also speaks to us in the form of stories. So what are the suggestions that emerge from this story? First and foremost, when Saraswati desired to have a child, Kavya or poetry was born and not Shastra. This is very significant because the ultimate objective of all poetry is Ananda, and Saraswati sought to experience Ananda, by or through her child. And this is also fascinating that the poetry, which is in the form of Shabda and Artha, of which the residing deity, of which the Abhimani Devata is Saraswati herself, poetry was formed in that way. There were various other kalas or arts as well. There was music, there was dance, sculpture, painting and so on. But Saraswati she did not choose to have a child in the form of literature or poetry, but the child who came to her assumed the form of poetry. This is also very significant because Saraswati is the patron deity of learning, especially of poetry. It is very appropriate that her child is poetry itself. And we already saw that the Ananda is the ultimate aim of poetry. The Taittiriya Upanishad says, one has to seek Ananda, and nobody would have anything to fear by anchoring himself or herself in Ananda. It says, Anando Brahmeti Vyajanat Anandadhyeva Khalvimani Bhutani Jayante, and so on. and poetry is the very embodiment of Ananda. And we have also seen that Kavya Purusha, as soon as he was born, began to speak in the form of verses. This is also very significant. Why? Because it tells us that metrical versification is natural to the Sanskrit language. We know that right from the Vedic Samhitas, we have this predilection to express ourselves in the form of verses. The Rigveda Samhita itself is metrical, though the metrical structure is not as sophisticated as in classical Sanskrit. Nonetheless, it has a metrical rhythm to it. And when we come to classical Sanskrit, there is a whole universe of meters that opens up before us. And that is the reason also why not just poetical works, but also works of various other disciplines are composed in the form of verses. Be it the Viveka Chudamani, which is a Vedantic work authored by Shankara Bhagavatpada, it is in the form of verses, or be it a lexicon like the Amarukosha, which is a list of synonyms and which is also a thesaurus and a dictionary, it is in the form of verses. Be it the Brihat Samhita, which is an encyclopedia of sorts, it is the meeting point of various branches of Indian knowledge. It is also in the form of verses and so on. So the idea is versification comes naturally to the Sanskrit language, and nowadays poets are beginning to compose stray verses, not metrical verses, and they should realize what they are missing out on. If you choose to ignore something that has come so naturally, so effortlessly, and which is also something very beautiful, you should really begin to think that what you have lost and what you have sacrificed by choosing not necessarily better alternatives. Now, we also know that Shukracharya is addressed as Kavi or a poet in this story. Why is this important? Because tradition tells us that Bhagavan Sri Krishna himself in the Bhagavad Gita says, Kavinam Ushanah Kavihi. I am Ushanas or Brahaspati among the poets. And the Amarakosha also has this to say, Ushana Bhargava Kavihi. So, Brahaspati or Shukracharya was a Bhargava. He was born into the lineage of the Bhrigus. And we know from Indian history, from the various Puranas, that these Bhargavas were very enterprising people. They were traders, they were businessmen, they flourished in the various professions, and they caused the economy of those times to bloom, to flourish, and they were also proficient in the various arts. They were also learned. Lakshmi herself was a Bhargavi in that she was born into the lineage of the Bhrigus. And we also know from other branches of learning, such as the Jyotisha Shastra or the Jyotish Shastra, that Shukracharya is the patron deity of the Purushartha Kama, the Kama Purushartha, the Abhimani Devata or the residing deity or the deity that is connected with the Kama Purushartha is Shukracharya. And poetry is obviously in connection with the Kama Purushartha. The meaning of the word Kama is desire, and whenever we desire something and we wish to express it beautifully, our expression takes the form of poetry more often than not, and that is why Shukracharya is addressed as a poet here. So in this way, the Artha and Kama, which are two major Purusharthas, are represented by the Bhrigus, and the foremost among the Bhrigus is Shukracharya, and no wonder that he is called as the Kavi here. And perhaps the greatest point of suggestion from this story, the greatest suggestion that we can derive and savor from this story is about Valmiki. Valmiki was the one who directed Saraswati to her child. When Saraswati was absolutely distraught by not seeing her child anywhere in the place that she had left the child, Valmiki came to her, and Valmiki had it in him to wipe the tears of Saraswati herself. So, because Valmiki had this inherent and innate compassion within him to unite a mother and her child, he could compose a Kavya, an epic like the Valmiki Ramayana, which is so rife, which is so rich with the Karuna Rasa. So, traditionally, the Angi Rasa or the uh, supreme or the primary rasa of Valmiki Ramayana is supposed to be the Karuna Rasa or pathos. So this pathos sprang up from Valmiki's inherent or innate compassion, and that is also one of the main reasons why he was moved when he saw this bird that was shot down by a hunter. Valmiki, the story goes, was a hunter himself. Why should he be moved by seeing another hunter bringing down this bird? It was because of his inherent compassion. And this is a great suggestion to derive from this story. And when Saraswati went to the Brahmaloka in order to clarify the meaning of a Vedic mantra, she went there only after she became the mother of Kavya and not before that. And why did Kavya Purusha remain here? Why did he not go to Brahmaloka with his mother? Why was he not allowed? The suggestion that we can derive from this aspect of the story is that Kavya can be savored only here on the earth, because in Devaloka or in Brahmaloka, the Devas or the deities do not have human emotions, do not have human feelings. If they have to be savored, they have to be humanized first. Kavya is there to be enjoyed only on earth, not on not in the Swarga, not in the Devaloka. Durbhikshan Devaloke. We can remember this statement in this regard. Professor M. Hiriyanna, a great scholar of Sanskrit and of Indian aesthetics, of Indian philosophy, and so on, he makes this very pointed observation that Valmiki Ramayana is supposed to be the Adi Kavya because it is centered on humans, on human emotions, and not on deities. The Vedas have elements of poetry in them, but they are not considered as poetic works. The reason is because they are centered on deities, whereas poetry proper is centered on humans. So, for it to be centered on humans, poetry should remain on the earth. That is why Kavya Purusha stayed here on the earth, whereas his mother Saraswati went back to the Devaloka or the Brahmaloka. And what is the significance of Kavya Purusha roaming around in all the directions? It relates to a fundamental aspect of poetry. Poetry is based on Kalpaka Shakti, on Kalpana or creative imagination, poetic imagination. And imagination is never static. It does not stand in one place. It is never stale. It never goes stale. That is why Kavya Purusha roams about, moves from one place to another. What does that signify? It signifies the Kalpaka Shakti, which lies at the very heart of the process of poetry. And uh, poetry reveals itself fully, poetry opens itself fully only to people who surrender themselves to it. So, as is evident in the case of Shukracharya, in the case of Valmiki, and even in the case of Sahitya Vidya Vadhu, they had to first surrender themselves to the Kavya Purusha, who was even there as a baby before them, or as an agreeable and perhaps a handsome young man before Sahitya Vidya Vadhu. She had to submit herself to him in order to win over him. So, if we do not read a work of poetry without submitting ourselves fully to it, we cannot enjoy it fully. We cannot derive the Dhvani Sukshmata from a work of poetry if we do not get ourselves involved in it completely first. So, in the definition of Sahridaya, Abhinavguptapada says in the Lochana, Varnaniya Tanmayi Bhavana Yogyata, Yeshang Kavyanushīlanābhyāsavashat Vishadī Bhūte Mano Mukare, Varnaniya Tanmayi Bhavana Yogyata, Te Swahridaya Samvada Bhajas Sahridayaha. This is the definition of a Sahridaya or a connoisseur, that he has to immerse himself in the work of art that he is supposed to contemplate on or that he is supposed to enjoy. This Tanmayi Bhava is submission in this context. So submission is very important in a connoisseur in order to appreciate or savor poetry. And Sahitya Vidya Vadhu approached the Kavya Purusha not in a very aggressive manner. She was blessed by Saraswati, she was blessed by not just Saraswati but by Parvati who created her. So she could have just walked up to Kavya Purusha and asked for his hand in marriage. She did not do it, but she went behind Kavya Purusha in a tone of Anunaya. She followed him wherever he went and persevered to win over his love. That is how poetry should be approached by all earnest seekers of poetry. And this is also suggestive on various levels because Sahitya Vidya Vadhu, like I explained, is the science of poetry, whereas Kavya Purusha is poetry himself, is poetry itself. So the Lakshya, the rules of, so the Lakshana should follow the Lakshya. Lakshya is the example, is poetry itself. It moves forward on its own accord as it pleases in whatever direction it likes, and the Lakshana, the definition, the science of poetry, it follows behind. Lakshana always follows the Lakshya. Lakshanusari Lakshanam Bhavet. This is the Nigamana, this is the Anumana that we should make from this story or from this aspect of the story at least. So this beautifully brings out the Paraspara Paripuraka Bhava of Shastra and Kavya, of how Shastra should follow poetry and how even poetry should lead on the Shastra. And why should it lead on? Not to escape from it, but to get united with it at some point. In order to achieve that unison, it has to reach a particular spot. And that unison should come about by a process of love and not by a process of forceful coercion. So these are some of the things that we can understand. These are some of the suggestions that we can derive out of this story. And Rajashekhara, like I said, relates to the various vrittis, ritis and pravrittis, which are concepts that are very integral to Alankara Shastra. He has embedded these concepts very beautifully in the course of this story. So vrittis relate to the feelings or the emotional landscape of all individuals, whereas pravrittis relate to the collective tastes of the people who reside in various regions. They are the regional preferences, so to speak. And ritis are the various styles of poetic expression. So the great scholar Dr. V. Raghavan, he has written an enlightening article on the vrittis. Bharata himself in the Natya Shastra says, Sarveshameva kavyanam vrittayo matrika smritaha. It means that the vrittis are the mothers of kavya. Vrittis are integral or foremost to the process of poetic expression. Evamete budhairjneya vrittayo natyamataraha. He says this again in the Natya Shastra. And Dr. V. Raghavan explains this in an article of his, that Natya is the imitation of action, and each action has its characteristic mood or atmosphere or disposition, mental feeling, so to say, with respect to the man in action as well as to the Sahridaya who sees the Natya. This mood or atmosphere or disposition is vritti. So basically, vrittis are the chitta vrittis or the various feelings or moods that are inherent in all of us. So if vrittis typically relate to the individual chitta vrittis, pravrittis are the collective chitta vrittis, are the tastes that get developed by this by the people who reside in a particular region by their collective chitta vrittis. And styles are the various ritis, they are the various poetic styles. So in this manner, a story that on the surface appears very trivial, appears to have no further significance, actually holds within itself very deep insights into the Alankara Shastra, into the science of poetry. I hope that scholars of the Sanskrit language take up studies such as this in a serious manner and not brush these stories aside as unimportant. I hope this talk is a humble attempt in that direction. Sarvebhyo Namaha. Thank you.